America at war with itself. Brother against brother, and neighbor against neighbor, a bitter, sad, and tragic affair. Yet the Civil War was the making of the United States, a fiery trial, in the immortal words of its greatest president. 4 years of blood and horror, sweat and tears, death and destruction. A quarter of those who took part did not survive to tell the tale. Almost as many died as in all the other wars America has fought before and since. It was a war that began with cavalry charges and infantry clashes redolent of Napoleonic times, but that ended with slaughter by massed rifles on a murderous scale. It was the first war to be covered by the camera, and the first to be fought between literate masses. Some of the diaries and letters written by those who participated make powerful reading even today. But to those who fell on the field of battle, it will always remain an unfinished story. One of the most evocative sounds in the world, suggesting the frontier and the West. In the 85 years between the War of Independence and the Civil War, the West was where the United States was growing fastest. And it was in the West, of course, where North and South first came to blows over slavery. Yet at a time when the sheer size of the country, as well as the differences between its peoples and regions, was threatening the survival of the great federal experiment, keeping it on the rails, as it were, was that reducer of the miles, the train. Although a relative newcomer to the American scene, the train would play a vital role in the Civil War. It was the first war in which it did. Without the Iron Road, the United States would never have flourished. By the eve of the Civil War, the 4 million Americans who had broken away from Britain had become 31 million, and the original 13 states of the Union had increased to 33. But not everyone welcomed this expansion, certainly not those living in the South. Southerners, in particular, felt that their distinctive way of life was threatened. Indeed, the South was increasingly seeing itself, and being seen, as different from the rest of the nation. Nothing symbolizes the Southern way of life more than the great plantation houses that still survive in all their splendor. The South boasted far more millionaires than any other region in the land. Southerners liked to flaunt their wealth, importing antiques and sumptuous furnishings from Europe. Most of these fortunes had been built on growing tobacco, rice, sugar, or, more often than not, cotton. The people who worked these plantations, which set the South apart from the rest of the country, were slaves. Their lifestyles were very different from their masters. Building magnificent mansions and laying out beautiful gardens, Southerners firmly believed that they had brought the best of European civilization to the American continent. The Yankees were dismissed as mere barbarians. A popular saying then was that the Northerner loved to make money, the Southerner to spend it. The South had always been a class society, the least changing region of the land. Many would argue that was its problem. While the North became increasingly industrial and city-oriented, the South remained agricultural and rural. Slavery, though, was the major difference. Although sprung from a revolution that proclaimed all men to be equal, the United States, by the 19th century, had become the largest ever slave-owning nation. The first Negroes were brought to Virginia in 1619, 12 years after the establishment of the initial settlement there, and 12 months before the Mayflower reached Massachusetts Bay.
Oh, Job, Job, ah, what you rang.
Most slaves would be bought and sold in auction at least once in their lifetimes, with all the degradation and brutal upheaval such a transaction implied. Knowing little else but work from an early age, fed, dressed, and housed at their owner's whim, and expected to show humility to any white within sight, slaves were the absolute chattels of their masters, who could, in effect, do what they liked with them. The system was certainly profitable for some, yet out of the bleakness came that most moving of music, the Negro spiritual, which vividly expressed the yearning for freedom by blacks and their surrender to sadness. While cotton growing was so lucrative, the slaves would not be freed willingly. Demand for cotton was escalating, from England in particular. By the eve of the Civil War, the South was supplying Europe with nearly 90% of its cotton. Cotton amounted to more than half of total United States exports. Hence the boast among many Southerners that cotton was king and ruled the American economy. But as the South became ever more dependent on cotton, it became ever more dependent on slavery and determined not to give it up. The treatment of slaves varied, of course, from plantation to plantation. Some owners were more humane than others. Even so, it was undoubtedly harsh.
We're talking about the fact that human beings were kept in bondage, and I think that anytime that occurs, it's harsh. But the advertisements for runaway slaves reveal that there was also that animalistic aspect of harshness too. Owners had to describe their slaves if they wanted them back, and all too often they would speak of this kind of, that kind of mark, which was a mark of violence. One remembers also that the 19th century instructed parents to punish their children, so that the 19th century would punish any ward of any kind, punish by whipping, etc., to the extent that in some communities they had laws regulating the number of lashes that one could receive. Although one must remember that every owner was his own law and in a position to decide himself how much punishment should be meted out.
Many in the North had always been opposed to slavery, largely on moral grounds. Perhaps the single most powerful piece of propaganda the anti-slavery or so-called abolitionist movement produced was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which first appeared in 1851. An instant bestseller in the United States, it was astonishingly successful in Europe, too, selling millions of copies in its first year of publication. For many today, Mrs. Stowe's characters appear stereotyped and her simple tales somewhat mawkish. But its account of white man's inhumanity to his weaker black brother struck a guilty chord in the North. It was a favorite subject also for that most Victorian of family pastimes, the lantern slide reading.
"Walk that Tom up here right away," said Legree. "The old cuss is at the bottom of this here whole matter." Tom heard the message with a forewarning heart, for he knew all the plan of the fugitive's escape. "Well, Tom," said Legree, "do you know I've made up my mind to kill you?" "It's very likely, Massa," said Tom calmly. It was but a moment, and Legree, foaming with rage, smote his victim to the ground. They washed his wounds. They provided a rude bed of some refuse cotton for him to lie down on. When George entered the shed, he felt his head giddy and his heart sick. "Uncle Tom, my poor old friend, I've come to buy you and take you home." "Oh, Master George, you're too late. The Lord's bought me and is going to take me home." And with a smile, he fell asleep.
But whatever the impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin on the abolitionist movement, the most emotionally charged episode in the developing clash between North and South over slavery occurred here, where the Shenandoah River joins the Potomac some 50 miles northwest of Washington. Harper's Ferry, the location then of a government weapons factory. In October 1859, an anti-slavery hardliner, already wanted for suspected murder, led an attack on the undefended arsenal, aiming to arouse Southern blacks and to use the captured guns to strike at the hated institution of slavery on its home soil. John Brown, whose raid this was, had with him only 18 men. It was a fiasco, and as a call to arms, fell on deaf ears. His little group included 5 Negroes and 3 of his own sons. Soon surrounded by a larger force, most of them were killed or captured. Brown was tried for treason against the state of Virginia, found guilty, and with 6 of his followers, executed within the month. The incident touched the South at its rawest nerve, the fear of an armed slave revolt. In the feverish mood that flourished then in the North, John Brown was crowned a martyr. The day he was hanged, bells tolled in many New England churches, while groups prayed openly for his soul. His testament read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." Within a few years, Yankee soldiers would march into battle to the words of a new anthem. John Brown's body lies a-moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. As the map of the United States filled in during the decades before the Civil War, Southerners became obsessed with the balance between slave and non-slave, or so-called free labor states. Because under the American Constitution, each state, no matter its size, sent 2 senators to Congress, where the Senate had the power effectively to block changes in legislation. Hitherto, the South had controlled the Senate and was determined to go on doing so for as long as possible. In this way, it could prevent any anti-slavery proposals becoming law. Bargaining and compromise had been the South's weapons to date, but the room for compromise was becoming less, and the opportunities for bargaining far fewer. The North was beginning to take a tougher line. Arguments whether slavery should be admitted to former Indian territories like Kansas and Nebraska brought people to blows. Both were north of the Missouri Compromise line, and hence should have been non-slave. That Southerners were trying to edge slavery into hitherto agreed forbidden areas alarmed many Northerners. The dispute broke up old political alliances and led to the formation of the Republican Party and the emergence of Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe, the rail splitter turned successful lawyer whose parents were semi-illiterate pioneers from Kentucky who had settled in the Midwest. A former Whig with a reputation for pragmatism and realism, combined with a deep devotion to the Union, Lincoln had broken with his previous party over slavery.
Lincoln comes to the scene in 1860 as in some ways a surprise. He was not a well-known politician prior to 1858 when he engaged in his famous debates with Stephen A. Douglas, and those certainly gave him a prominence in Republican and in national politics that he otherwise wouldn't have had. But I think the event that really brought Lincoln to the fore, and which in a sense is at the root of the coming of the war itself, was the creation of the Republican Party in 1855-56, a party which was dedicated to questioning the existence of slavery in the territories. And Lincoln quickly became a prominent member within that party. And when the time came in 1860 for a candidate to be chosen, he seemed to be one who had grasped the issue of slavery in a fairly moderate way, as compared with, say, Seward, who was much more outspoken and had been much more outspoken on the question than Lincoln.
Here in Charleston, South Carolina, the fateful 12 months that led up to the Civil War began and ended. Charleston then was a city of 35,000 souls where the two rivers, the Ashley and the Cooper, came together in the local boast to form the Atlantic Ocean. Charlestonians were given to extravagant behavior as well as extravagant comments. They considered themselves the epitome of Southernness, and their fine city the focus of Southern traditions and ideals. In April 1860, Charleston's gracious houses hosted the delegates to the Democratic Party convention, come to nominate a candidate for the presidential election that November. During the months following John Brown's raid, the atmosphere in the South had been charged. Militia units stepped up their training. Meanwhile, the convention could not agree on a candidate and adjourned. Before it met again, the Republicans had nominated Abraham Lincoln. When the Democrats reconvened, they ended up with two candidates, which helped ensure Lincoln's victory, though not before Southerners had asserted that a Republican success would justify their leaving the Union and forming a Confederacy. The 7 states of the Deep South did not even wait for Lincoln to be inaugurated as president. South Carolina, as usual, led the way. Within hours of Lincoln's election, the state legislature there had called for a special convention to consider secession. Within the month, it had met at Charleston and agreed unanimously to take South Carolina out of the Union. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all followed within a matter of weeks. In February 1861, representatives from these 7 seceding states met at Montgomery, Alabama, to elect a senator from Mississippi, Jefferson Davis, as their president, and to agree on a constitution for the so-called Confederate States of America. Charleston, appropriately enough, was where the dramatic events that finally led to war took place. The presence within some of the seceding states of federal forts manned by federal garrisons presented problems, none more so than Fort Sumter here in Charleston Harbor. Soon it had taken on a symbolic value out of all proportion to its military importance. The Confederacy feared that its case for recognition as a sovereign nation would be compromised as long as another power maintained an armed presence within one of its main harbors, while for the federal authority, it was a question of the loss of face if the forts were surrendered to states in rebellion. Just a month after Lincoln's inauguration, Washington made a final attempt to relieve and replenish Fort Sumter. An unarmed convoy was due to arrive off Charleston the night of April 11th, 12th. 2 days before that, the local Confederate general called on Major Robert Anderson, the federal commander of the fort, to surrender. Anderson waited 24 hours before declining, realizing full well the inevitable response, but trusting in a more divine providence. Knowing the Northern relief ships were at hand, the Confederates began firing on Fort Sumter at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, watched by a crowd of eager Charlestonians. The bombardment lasted 34 hours, with more than 4,000 rounds being shot off in the direction of the luckless fort, and a mere 1,000 fired in reply before Anderson decided he and his men had had enough. The damage to the fort was extensive, though miraculously no one had been killed. 4 of the garrison had been wounded, as had 4 of the Confederate gunners on shore. The only deaths happened later, when a Federal soldier lost his life while firing a salute during the surrender ceremony. Another was fatally injured in an ensuing explosion. Alas, they were to be merely the first of many as America's bloodiest conflict got underway. With the secessionists having fired on the flag, Northerners rallied to defend the Union. Baffled and bemused before, they now knew where they stood and seemed relieved. The months of inactivity gave way to frenzied preparations. Patriotism reared its head as the Northern states vied to supply recruits for the Union cause. Most were eager to reply in kind for Sumter as soon as possible. In the South, Sumter lifted secessionist fervor to fever pitch. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to volunteer, anxious not to miss out on the great adventure, convinced it was an opportunity of a lifetime. Sumter appeared to confirm the conventional wisdom that one Southerner could whip 10 Yankees. The Times correspondent reported from Charleston, "Secession is the fashion here. Young ladies sing for it, old ladies pray for it, young men are dying to fight for it." But Sumter had destroyed for the South the dream that its independence could be won without a fight. It brought, however, 4 more states into the Confederate camp: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Lines were being drawn and positions taken. The Charleston batteries had ended the years of bickering over slavery and states' rights. Might was now to decide it all. Most believed, though, that the war would not last long. Settled, no doubt, in a single gallant and hopefully bloodless encounter, and then they could return to living again. No one had any idea of the enormity and tragic nature of the struggle upon which they were embarking, least of all those Northerners who now flocked to the colors. Within the day of Sumter's surrender, Lincoln summoned into Union service thousands of militiamen to suppress the South's rebellion. Tearful farewells became the norm as Northerners answered their president's call. The sounds of recruiting rallies filled the air. "So impatient did I become for starting," said one volunteer, "that I felt like 10,000 pins were pricking me in every part of my body." The choice of color for their uniforms, rather than the prospect of terrible carnage ahead, occupied the minds of the new soldiers. More offered their services than the authorities could handle, let alone equip. Getting them to the front was a problem, too. That no one before had ever conquered a territory the size of the South did not deter the North from its preparations for war. While the North knew that in order to win it had to defeat the South in battle, the Confederates did not have to defeat anyone. They could remain on the defensive forever, and if the Union eventually got tired of fighting and quit, independence would be theirs. The gaily colored uniforms belied the seriousness of it all. Northerners were anxious to bring Southerners to their senses by depriving them of outside help and by impressing them with the Union's resolve to end their rebellion. Delay suited the South while it sought foreign recognition. Washington was soon surrounded by tents. Equipment would never be a problem for the North. Its greater resources and easier access to foreign suppliers gave it an edge from the start. It also had almost a 4-to-1 advantage in white manpower. As the summer wore on and discipline within the camps relaxed, the onus was on the North to make the first move. The snag was that life under canvas was beginning to take on a separate existence. Food was always in good supply on the Union side, though the diet of fatty bacon and hard biscuit became fairly boring. By contrast, the rebel soldiers often went hungry. One thing that was to have considerable impact on the war was photography, then only 20 years old and still a matter for experts.
There was one basic process used worldwide, and that was called the wet plate process. It gets its name because the glass plate negative actually had to be damp in order to be light sensitive. So the photographer had to actually have a darkroom wagon with him on the spot. He had to make the negative, expose it, and develop it all within about 10 minutes before that plate dried. Now, it's a very, very cumbersome process, but there is absolutely nothing primitive about the results. The photographs, in fact, are superior to a lot of what is taken today. You had two main popular forms that Civil War photographs came in. Probably the most popular of all, and this was for studio portraiture, was the carte de visite. It's a French word. It means visiting card. These became popular in the United States in 1860, and they very quickly attracted a great deal of attention. They were relatively inexpensive. They could be mass-produced. They were very convenient to send through the mails. And in 1861, when the soldiers go off to war, more had their portraits taken as carte de visites than any other form. And very quickly, people realized that these things would fit very nicely in albums, so you had a sub-industry created, and that is the carte de visite albums, and you'd have pictures of your Uncle Harry and your grandfather, and also your uncle who was in the service. And the photographs were very, very important to the servicemen and to the families back home. Now, as far as field photography, battlefield photography is concerned, the stereo view was king. These three-dimensional stereo views were produced in large quantities. I would venture to say that of the actual battlefield outdoor series that were recorded, 75% were originally taken with the twin-lens stereo camera. And if you've never seen an original Civil War view in 3D, it's very dramatic. And the stereo view was for the Civil War populace what TV is for us today.
The summer's fun was about to end and the fighting to begin, though the Union soldiers' families did not see it that way. They thought the coming battle would be fun too and stayed on to watch. Many of the men had volunteered only for 3 months and wanted some action before returning home. They had expected the war won by now. Northern public opinion had been demanding revenge since Sumter, and once the Confederacy had the nerve in June to move its capital to Richmond, a mere 120 miles from Washington, a clash was inevitable. Both sides moved up their guns, eager and confident. The cream of Washington society rode out as if for a picnic to see the rebels get whipped. Ordinary folk came too, anxious not to miss the great spectacle. Some brought their black servants. All believed the war would be won by nightfall. July 21st, a Sunday, was when the North felt ready to strike. Ground sheets in hand, the crowds hurried for the best view. Generals' wives, congressmen, even a member of Lincoln's cabinet. Manassas, 25 miles south of Washington, was the place destined for the first battle. The French-style Zouaves from Louisiana hurried to the Confederacy's defense. The North's advance had hardly been concealed. They had taken 3 days to get into position. Any hope of surprise was lost. Fire! In their keenness to be as close to the action as possible, some of the picnickers had located themselves right in the path of the Federal advance and had to be persuaded to move. For most taking part, it was their first battle. The Union Army was easily the largest ever seen in North America. Outnumbered, the Confederates fell back. Casualties were heavy on both sides, partly because the soldiers were so inexperienced. The intense July heat did not help either. 22,000 Confederates were opposing 35,000 Union troops, twice as many as George Washington had led against the British at Yorktown during the War of Independence. The rifles of the infantrymen were much more accurate and could be reloaded much more quickly than the muskets of old, hence the greater casualties. The battle ebbed and flowed across the rich Virginia farmland, with the troops trampling underfoot the crops ready for harvesting. Few generals on either side at this stage of the war realized the enormous impact the new rifle would make. Just as the Union soldiers were beginning to tire, many of them had not eaten or drunk anything since early morning, the Confederates secretly switched fresh forces by train from the Shenandoah Valley. This was to make all the difference, though the Northern generals should have prevented it. The many-colored uniforms on both sides led to tragic confusion when, at a critical moment in the battle, some Northerners fired on their own men dressed in gray. Thereafter, blue became the standard Union color. The battle was America's most costly to date. Onslaught followed onslaught against the Union positions. Northerners for the first time were experiencing the rebel yell, a high-pitched wailing scream delivered on the run. Said a Federal soldier, "There is nothing like it this side of hell." Since the infantrymen had to bite open their own cartridges, strong front teeth were essential. By late afternoon, much of the Northern Army had had enough and began to withdraw. Sensing victory, the Confederates pressed home their advantage, and soon the Federal retreat became a rout. Though weary themselves, the Southerners fought on. The roads back to Washington became cluttered with fleeing civilians as well as panic-stricken troops. The Union retreat was dubbed later the Great Skedaddle. For a while, Washington seemed wide open, but the rebels were not organized sufficiently to follow up their remarkable victory. Many on the Southern side would rue the missed opportunity of Manassas forever. For Northerners, Manassas was a harsh awakening. Talk of a short war disappeared. They now knew they had a proper fight on their hands. For Southerners, a breathing space had been achieved in which to seek foreign recognition through the plane of the Cotton Card.
As part of the sense of self-confidence that the Southerners felt, they believed that cotton ruled the world, in fact. The British economy would collapse without cotton, and therefore the British government, to protect itself, would intervene on behalf of the South. France would do the same. Of course, this was totally false. There was no reason why the British economy could not keep going without cotton. As a matter of fact, what had occurred was that the crops had been so enormous for such a long period before this that there was an oversupply within the British warehouses. So the British didn't have to face this problem.
Even so, Britain and the North nearly came to blows on the high seas over the Union's efforts to deny the South foreign supplies. But no matter how hard the Northern sailors tried, the blockade was never wholly effective. Most Southern boats got through. While Union crews grew bored watching Confederate harbors, the captains of the blockade runners, many of them British, grew rich trading in luxuries that commanded premium prices in the South. Although wooden sailing vessels were still the most common, armored ships were coming in. The boat that was going to make all the difference in the naval war was the ironclad, and in this the North would have the edge. Called monitors, they were among the most bizarre sights of the age. A tin can on a shingle was how one contemporary derided them. Their significant feature was armor plating. The forerunners of these had first appeared during the Crimean War some years before. France had set the pace in their development, with Britain some way behind, and America nowhere. Now the conflict between North and South was to become a test bed for this revolution in naval warfare. The South was off the mark first, when they modified a wooden hulk named the Merrimac, which caused havoc among the blockading fleet near Norfolk, Virginia in early March 1862. By coincidence, the North's first Monitor reached the scene the very next day, and the first clash between ironclads began. For 4 hours, these two latter-day sea monsters threw everything at each other in one of the most unusual maritime combats ever witnessed. The shots simply bounced off each other's armor plating like peas from a pop gun, as one observer wrote. Since action photography had not been developed then, painters and engravers had a field day, as indeed they did at every major Civil War engagement. Not just the Atlantic coastline saw such clashes. By far the most important took place on the rivers of the West, particularly the Mississippi. Here, New Orleans is falling to Northern gunships. Coupled with Fort Henry's capture on the Tennessee earlier, the Union plan to drive the rebels from the Mississippi Valley had begun well. Taking the Confederate fort here at nearby Donelson on the Cumberland River was more difficult. Sighted on high ground, its guns wrought havoc on the Union fleet steaming against it. But the Northern troops, commanded by a certain Ulysses S. Grant, who had come overland from Fort Henry, surrounded it and compelled its surrender. When asked for terms, Grant replied, "Only unconditional surrender can be accepted." He instantly acquired the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. The victories opened up the Confederacy's heartland to invasion. Within the month, the Union forces moved down the Tennessee River as far as here at Shiloh. Confident they had the rebels on the run, they did not dig any defenses, but the Southerners planned to surprise them.
The Battle of Shiloh started on the morning of April 6, 1862, about 2.5 miles to the southwest of here. Confederates attacking the Union forces and forcing them in this direction. During the morning, the battle went the way the Confederates wanted it to. They continually pushed the Union forces back. Finally, about 11 o'clock in the morning, the Union forces, a portion of them, dug in this area, which is the Hornet's Nest. We're actually standing in the sunken road, which borders one edge of the Hornet's Nest. The Confederates, when they hit this area, attacked across this open field and through the woods behind me. The attacks started about 11 in the morning, and they lasted until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The commander in this area, the Union commander's orders were, hold your position at all costs, stop the Confederate attacks. The Confederates attacked 11 times, but they were never able to break the position. They finally brought up a battery of artillery, which started bombarding this area, pinning the Union forces down. This allowed the Confederates to move around them and surround them. However, the Union troops had done their job. Grant was able to build a defensive line back at Pittsburgh Landing, 2 miles to the northeast of us, and stopped the Confederate advance on the 6th. And on the morning of April the 7th, reinforced by Buell's Army of the Ohio, he moved out, forcing the Confederates to withdraw back toward Corinth.
Shiloh had an enormous impact. More men died here than in all the previous wars in which America had been involved. Wrote the poet Herman Melville, "What like a bullet can undeceive?" It was also the first Civil War battle to have a ballad written about it. In no other American war did music play such an important part.
Come all you valiant soldiers, a story I will tell. about the bloody battle that was fought on Shiloh Hill. It was an awful struggle and will cause your blood to chill. It was the famous battle that was fought on Shiloh Hill. It was the 6th of April, just at the break of day. The drums and fifes were playing for us to march away. About the hour of sunrise, the battle it began, and before the day had vanished, we fought them hand to hand. The wounded men were crying for help from everywhere, while others who were dying were offering God their prayer. Protect my wife and children if it is thy holy will. Oh, such were the prayers I heard that night on Shiloh Hill. And early the next morning we were called to arms again, unmindful of the wounded, unuseful to the slain. The struggle was renewed and 10,000 men were killed. This was the second conflict of the famous Shiloh Hill. Before the day was ended, the battle ceased to roar, and thousands of brave soldiers had fell to rise no more. They left their vacant ranks for some other ones to fill, and now their moldering bodies all lie on Shiloh Hill.
Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, scene of bitter Union upsets. Despite successes elsewhere, the North was doing disastrously here in the East. The Southern armies relied for their food on this rich valley near the Appalachian Mountains. The breadbasket of the Confederacy was how some described it. The Union was determined to deny that benefit to the rebels. But although outnumbering them here by more than 4 to 1, its attempts to do so failed, and the federal capital, a mere 60 or so miles away, was on occasion threatened. Barely 3 months after Manassas, the North had suffered another humiliation at a place called Ball's Bluff, just across the Potomac above Washington. The fiasco seemed to suggest that the Union troops, in the East at least, were still not quite ready. That winter, the Army sat it out around Washington. The popular song on both sides was "All Quiet Along the Potomac Tonight," the words by a Northern woman and the music by a Southern man. During the lull, the camp photographers went to work.
All quiet along the Potomac tonight, except here and there a stray picket is shot as he walks on his beat to and fro by a rifleman hid in the thicket. 'Tis nothing, a private or two now and then will not count in the news of the battle.
When spring came, Lincoln prodded his generals into action. Instead of doing so head-on, as at Manassas the previous summer, they preferred now to outflank the Confederates by shipping their troops down the Potomac to Fort Monroe, where the Federals retained a foothold. Richmond was only 70 miles away. But once the 100,000 men got ashore, they had to besiege one Southern bastion after another. The numerous creeks the Union troops had to cross also delayed progress. The rebel river batteries foiled the more direct approach. Following a demonstration in Washington by a scientist-cum-showman called Thaddeus Lowe, Lincoln sanctioned the establishment of a balloon corps that saw action in the Richmond campaigns. The balloons seldom went higher than 300 feet, which allowed the observer to see for 15 miles in every direction, and they were linked to the ground by telegraph. Flights at dawn were preferred. Not only were the air currents then usually favorable, but the intelligence gleaned from the location of campfires and the early movements of patrols could be most valuable. After bitter fighting, the Union forces by mid-May had pushed to within 5 miles of the Confederate capital. Panic seized the rebel leadership, but the Southerners fought back gallantly and halted the Northern advance at terrible cost to both sides. 11,000 casualties in one day, including the Confederate commander. His replacement now planned a counterattack at the point where the Union troops were most stretched and caught them on the hop. During 7 days of sustained fighting, some of the fiercest of the whole war, the Confederates forced the Northerners to retreat. The carnage of the Richmond battles was appalling. More than 30,000 died or were severely wounded. To Lincoln's great annoyance, the Union troops withdrew as they had come. The victor was Robert E. Lee, who had been the rebel replacement. He now became the North's bogeyman and the South's eternal hero. He had set in train a dramatic turnaround in the fortunes of war. A second confrontation at Manassas produced another humiliation for the Union. Realizing that a Southern victory on Northern soil might tempt the British to intervene and persuade the Yankees to sue for peace, Lee crossed the Potomac west of Washington, aiming to get behind the federal capital, but was halted along Antietam Creek. The ensuing battle on September 17th should have seen the end of Lee, since a quarter of his men dropped out through fatigue and he himself was injured. In addition, plans for disposing his forces fell into Northern hands. For days, the creek at Antietam ran red with American blood. It had been the bloodiest 24 hours of the whole war. Those who took part did not realize how much hung on the battle's outcome. Britain was poised to recognize the South. A Confederate victory here might just have clinched it, and also dampened the North's enthusiasm for continuing the war. But for those who fell amid the wheat fields, then as now ready for harvesting, such matters were beyond their ken. Caring for the injured so taxed the local communities that the area became, according to a visitor, one vast hospital. A federal officer walking the fields the following day wrote, "No matter in what direction we turned, it was all the same shocking picture, awakening awe rather than pity, benumbing the senses rather than touching the heart." Within just 5 months of Shiloh, the viciousness of the war had escalated alarmingly, and many were now wondering where it would all end. Some of the bitterest fighting occurred here along this ancient sunken road, immortalized in this painting by a survivor of the battle, James Hope from Vermont. It has, perhaps inevitably, been known ever since as Bloody Lane. The Confederate dead lay 3 deep for half a mile, mowed down, in the words of their commander, like grass before the scythe. Lee was not defeated at Antietam, but his army was so bloodied that even though they had fought the Union forces to a standstill, they still had to retreat back to Virginia. Antietam was not just the bloodiest day in the whole Civil War, but the bloodiest ever in American history. 8,000 lives were ended here, and another 18,000 severely wounded. The casualties were 4 times those the United States suffered on D-Day in World War II. Entire units on either side were virtually annihilated. Lincoln went to Antietam after the battle principally to press his generals into pursuing Lee. But they were now too much in awe of him to do that, despite the rebels' disorganization. The Union president did take the opportunity of the stalemate, however, to issue his Emancipation Proclamation.
I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America and Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy thereof.
Lincoln had realized he needed to counter the move within Britain towards recognizing the South after the Union's second humiliation at Manassas. The proposal he had in mind was freedom for the slaves within the Confederacy. When he had informed his cabinet of this earlier, they persuaded him to delay announcing it until success came in battle.
Or may be suspended or disturbed.
Virginia's Capitol, seat of the rebel government in Richmond, was a scene of much dismay at Antietam's outcome and of outrage at Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. It was seen as a deliberate attempt to incite the slaves to revolt. The Confederate cabinet sought to alarm conservative opinion in Europe by claiming the North was raising the red flag of revolution. But it was all baying in the wind. The rebels had lost the initiative, political as well as military. Jefferson Davis, whose home this was in Richmond during the war, the so-called Confederate White House, was proving no match for Lincoln. For Southerners, the struggle was turning out costly. Northerners, by contrast, could breathe more easily after Antietam.
Hurrah for Mary, hurrah for the Lamb, hurrah for the soldier who didn't give a damn. And we'll rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. Hurrah.
With Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the war for Northerners had become one not just to save the Union, but also now to free the blacks. It meant they would be considered liberators, which gave them a moral aura.
Shouting the battle cry of freedom.
Confederate hopes of foreign intervention were now effectively ended. Britain, with its anti-slavery tradition, could not side with the South, which would have to fight on alone against the North's superior forces. Because of their better horsemanship, Southerners had the edge in cavalry tactics from the start. The role of the cavalry was changing, though. No longer was it the offensive arm of old. Now it played a much more auxiliary part in reconnaissance, carrying dispatches, attacking enemy communications, protecting their own army's flanks, scouring the countryside for forage, and even acting as military police in rounding up stragglers, as well as, of course, intercepting the opposing cavalry. The infantry still thought the cavalry led an easy life, galloping splendidly around the countryside instead of wearily slogging everywhere on foot. But the cavalryman had to care for his mount, even putting its well-being ahead of his own. Nevertheless, the cavalry always seemed to attract people with a liking for flamboyance and grandeur, romance and excitement. The Confederate cavalry had a reputation for wearing the most outrageous outfits, as well as looking like the most disheveled, cutthroat rogues imaginable. It was here in the West, of course, where the cavalry came into its own. Most of the early battles were hardly different in appearance from any fought a century before. Yet the means of fighting had changed dramatically. At the beginning of the war, few realized the difference the development of the rifled musket would make on infantry tactics. In the Mexican War, which was the immediately previous conflict in which Americans had fought, artillery had been the king of battles. But in the Civil War, infantry would reassert itself with a weapon that could kill a man at 300 yards and a good chance of killing him at double that distance. The old-style tactics of standing shoulder to shoulder while advancing en masse were doomed to terrible casualties. No longer would soldiers get off only one volley before being attacked with the bayonet. Most cavalrymen still carried sabers, though firearms were increasingly used. Union horsemen were generally the better equipped, but the rebels made up for these deficiencies with an abundance of dash and daring. Casualties were horrendous. Because of the new weapons and the numbers of men involved, it became ever more difficult for officers to control their troops. Most engagements were broken off before reaching a resolution.
The typical Civil War battle is non-decisive. The two sides come together, they bang the heck out of each other. They do hurt each other quite a bit, but they don't destroy each other. They disengage, they limp back, lick their wounds, and fight again another day. And the Civil War armies lacked the power to annihilate each other. They typically did not have the power to totally destroy the ongoing fighting capability of the other side.
Neither army had organized at the outset any system for finding and treating the wounded, who sometimes lingered for hours before securing attention. More men died from wounds received in battle than were killed in battle. For many, reaching the ambulances was the beginning, not the end of their agony. The casualty rates took the medical facilities on both sides by surprise. No one was prepared for the Holocaust into which the nation had lurched, least of all its leaders. In many ways, it was a mercy to be killed outright on the battlefield. Treatment was fairly basic, and often more dangerous than the original injury. If a man was shot in the arm or leg and a compound fracture resulted, amputation was almost automatic. After a battle, limbs would pile up outside the surgeon's tents. For anesthetic, the wounded would either bite on a bullet or be given a slug of whiskey. Doctors were not callous. It was just that medicine was still somewhat primitive. Few saw the need to sterilize instruments to avoid infection. Amputations often took place in the open air under makeshift conditions. Scant attention was given to hygiene in the few field hospitals that existed, which were little more than groups of tents where men lay on the bare ground. For the amputees and the other severely wounded, there was no attempt at therapy to prepare them for the shock of civilian life. Mothers and wives only learned of the fate of their dear ones by reading about it in the local newspaper or seeing their names pinned up on a notice board in the nearest town. The fate of prisoners was often as hazardous as that of the wounded. It was as dangerous to be captured as to remain in combat. Although some still argue to the contrary, Confederates fared better at Union hands than vice versa. Richmond's Libby prison was particularly notorious for its ill treatment of Union captives, though Andersonville in Georgia was the worst. Starvation and lack of sanitation killed inmates by the thousand and produced scenes of unparalleled horror. One Southern woman was so shocked by what she saw there that she confided to her diary, "My heart aches for the poor wretches, Yankees though they are, and I am afraid that God will suffer some terrible retribution to fall upon us for letting such things happen."
America had never had to contend with large numbers of prisoners at that time. In the American Revolution and the War of 1812, battlefield paroles were given to the relatively few number of men who were captured. In the Civil War, with 3 million men in the field fighting, the number of men taken prisoners was so large that neither side felt it expedient to use paroles, so they began the problem, to attack the problem of what to do with prisoners of war, and they had no guidelines, and both sides made terrible mistakes. The sites of the prisons was almost consistently incredibly bad for reasons that no one can say. The administration of the prisons was an administration marked by incompetence because it was based on ignorance, and thus suffering was very, very intense. 56,000 men will die in the prisons of North and South. And it's a story that would at best be forgotten, but for the fact that all those men perished, and that should teach us something.
Baker's Creek, Mississippi, some 20 miles east of Vicksburg on the Mississippi. Ever since the Battle of Shiloh the year before, the federal troops in the West under Ulysses S. Grant had been trying to clear the Mississippi Valley of rebels. It had, of course, been the North's aim from the start of the war to divide the Confederacy from its friends across the river. Preventing that plan from succeeding was the rebel bastion at Vicksburg. Grant had tried to attack it by the long overland route from the north, but had been so harried by Confederate cavalry that he had to give up. Now he was trying to approach the bastion from the south and east.
Casualty coming and going.
Check the barrels and make sure they don't have any mud in them. Without doubling. Yeah, I am. Right face. Arms at will.
The Union forces had cast themselves loose from their supply base in early May 1863 and were living off the land. They had burnt the Mississippi state capital, Jackson, which had not pleased the rebels, who were now on their track. The Federals were having problems fighting in the woods. Unable to gauge the strength of the enemy, they were inclined to be cautious. The Confederates certainly still had some fight left in them, especially when provoked. After all, this was their country, and they resented the Yankees' incursions.
Hey, Yank!
The commander of the rebel garrison at Vicksburg had sent part of his force to tackle Grant's invaders. They met at Champion Hill, halfway between Jackson and Vicksburg.
Commence firing. Raise your head, Johnny, I'll blow your brains out! You going up here, you dead. Eat shit and die. We got a hard tack for you, rebel. Oh. head. Drop out his arms. Yes. There. Get across the board. Down, Captain.
The Confederates mounted another Blain battle here on the Big Black River, 10 miles nearer Vicksburg. Although not as bloody as Champion Hill, where more than 1,000 men had been killed, it was just as decisive. Rebuffed yet again, the Vicksburg garrison withdrew within their defenses. Thinking final victory was his for the taking, Grant attacked straight away, but was thrown back with heavy losses. He tried a second time a few days later with the same result. He resorted to assaulting from the river, but his gunboats were repulsed by the Confederate shore batteries. Once more, the casualties were considerable. Anxious to avoid a siege, Grant threw everything into another attack. His colleague, William Tecumseh Sherman, confided to his wife, "This is a death struggle." But with his soldiers hungry and his supplies dwindling, Grant faced the inevitable and settled down to a siege. Vicksburg's garrison and citizens now faced daily bombardments from Grant's field artillery, which completely surrounded the town. Vicksburg was also ringed by massive earthworks that ran in a 7-mile arc around the town. No Union force had yet faced such impressive defenses. Penned inside the circle of cannon were 34,000 soldiers and civilians. Besieging them were 50,000 Federals. Perched high on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi, Vicksburg commanded the great river's middle reaches. And as long as Vicksburg held out, passage down it was denied to those Midwestern farmers who were among Lincoln's loudest critics. They had suffered badly from the South's secession, and Lincoln was keen to recover their support. Because of the continual bombardment, most Vicksburg civilians spent their time in caves burrowed into the hillsides. There were 500 of these caves. What kept people going was the hope that somehow they would be relieved. But the Confederates were faring better in the east. At Chancellorsville, Virginia, in May 1863, Lee had what came to be known as his greatest victory. He could now do no wrong in his leadership's eyes. He determined to press home his advantage by again invading the North, hoping a further victory there might so damage Northern morale that Lincoln would be forced to negotiate a peace. Within the month of Chancellorsville, Lee crossed the Potomac west of Washington with 80,000 men. A week or so later, he had penetrated Pennsylvania as far as its state capital, Harrisburg, aiming to destroy its rail links with the Midwest. But the Federal forces, under a new commander, were hard on his heels near the little market town of Gettysburg. It was a shortage of shoes that brought the rebels to Gettysburg, where there was a footwear factory. When a group of Confederate infantrymen made their way into the town in search of shoes, they ran into some Union cavalry. Thus began the most important battle of the Civil War, and perhaps the most crucial in American history. What opened as a skirmish, in the end, involved 160,000 troops. The Southerners drove the Northerners from the town onto a gentle ridge near the local cemetery. Lee urged his generals to dislodge them, but they hesitated. By the time they moved, the Federals had brought up reinforcements and had dug themselves in. All that second day, some of the bitterest fighting raged at places now forever etched in America's memory. Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the wheat field, the peach orchard. However great their courage, the rebels could not shift the Northerners. Lee's colleagues tried to dissuade him from continuing to attack such a strong position, but he was convinced one final push would do the trick. He determined to strike where he thought the Union would least expect, in the center of their line on Cemetery Hill. For this, he would use General Pickett's division, Virginians like himself. As July 3rd dawned, they assembled in the woods opposite Cemetery Hill. The die was cast for the war's climax. The Confederate cannon opened up on the hill. Then, at 3 p.m. precisely, the guns gave way as the Virginians emerged from the woods. Many Northerners admitted afterwards that the Virginians had appeared irresistible. Certainly, they were one of the most awesome sights of the whole war. Pickett's charge was about to begin. The rebels advanced through the fields of ripening corn. As they neared their goal, the clump of trees atop Cemetery Hill, the Federal artillery suddenly blasted forth to scythe through the gray-clad ranks. The slaughter and noise were horrific. For another hour, the battle raged as the Southerners pressed on. As ammunition ran out, men grappled hand to hand, using their rifles as clubs and their bayonets as spears. The few of Pickett's division who made it to the copse were cut down in their brief moment of glory. Soon the remainder were falling back. Less than half made it home again. Nearly 7,500 of them were left on the field. At the very moment Pickett had begun his charge, Vicksburg was at long last surrendering. This dual defeat was the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Abandoning their dead, the Southerners withdrew to Virginia. They had suffered 28,000 casualties in 3 days, nearly 40% of their force. Four months after Gettysburg, Lincoln made a rare excursion to attend the dedication of a new cemetery there. He spoke second, after the main orator had delivered a formal 2-hour address. Lincoln's speech lasted little more than 2 minutes. Many of his audience scarcely heard him, and much of the press considered his paltry few words unequal to the occasion. But they were to become an indelible part of the political thought and language of the whole world.
87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
In seeking to define the war aims of the Union, Lincoln arrived at a definition of democracy itself. He never doubted the significance of what was happening on battlefields like Gettysburg. As the struggle mounted in ferocity and viciousness, it was taking on a deeply spiritual tone.
If you look at the second inaugural address of Lincoln, where he says, if every drop of blood drawn by the slash must be repaid by one drawn by the sword, so as it was said 2,000 years ago in the Bible, so be it. God is on our side, and that's the conviction of both sides. And if you, for example, listen to the music, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the terrible swiftness of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. That kind of attitude means, therefore, that you are fighting not simply a war, you're fighting a holy crusade. In the South, as the war began to escalate and the consequences of the war began to become clearly evident, everyone in the South understood that the whole of what was the South was now on the wheel of fortune, and no one could be sure what the consequences were going to be.
Southern mothers were now left to grieve, not just at a son departing, but more likely at a son killed. Both sides were dipping deep into their manpower reserves. Violent protests, as happened here in New York City, followed the resort to a draft in the North, a year after the Confederacy had done so. Estimates of the numbers killed in the New York draft riots of July 1863 vary from 120 to 1,200, though at the time some of the wilder rumors put the figure at several thousand. Certainly, they were the worst street violence America has ever known. Units that had recently fought at Gettysburg had to be recalled to quell them. What began as a protest against the first draft under the new law quickly turned into an ugly race riot, in which not only was a Negro orphanage burnt to the ground, but at least a dozen blacks were senselessly lynched. Resentment towards Negroes among immigrant communities, such as the Irish, had been inflamed by recent strikes broken by employers bringing in blacks. The riots showed that racial prejudice was never far below the surface in the North. Lincoln was determined, though, to press on with emancipation. Recruitment of Negro troops began in the North after January 1863. Eventually, 200,000 would serve the Union, about a tenth of the total strength. At first, they were given menial duties. Lincoln, like others, was not convinced of their military value. Black leaders, however, believed that once former slaves had fought for their country, they would not be denied citizenship. Wherever it appeared in the South, the Federal Army acted as a magnet in drawing out the slaves. Most blacks could recall the moment when a Northern official first told them they were free. By the end of the war, about a quarter of the slave population in the Confederacy had freed itself by moving behind Union lines. This loss hindered the Southern war effort. For many, though, their reception was not as warm nor their treatment as tactful as it might have been. What they cried out for was land from which to derive a livelihood. But not even Lincoln was ready for this. For one thing, he faced re-election in 1864. With war weariness growing in the North, many did not expect him to succeed. A Lincoln defeat at the polls was possibly the South's last chance of winning independence. To avoid that, Lincoln needed a major military victory. After Gettysburg, stalemate had ensued in the East. Hopefully, success might come elsewhere. Perhaps it would be in the West, where Lincoln had his eyes on Chattanooga, which stood on a vital east-west rail link where the Tennessee River cut through the mountains. Capturing Chattanooga would further split the Confederacy and provide a springboard for a drive on Atlanta, one of the South's key communication and manufacturing centers. Chattanooga fell in September 1863, but within the month the Federals almost walked into a trap at Chickamauga, a few miles to the south. As a result, the local commander was replaced by Ulysses S. Grant, who managed to turn the tables on the rebels. Although Northerners hated to admit it, there was still a lot of life left in the Confederacy. That Southerners could still produce the unexpected was demonstrated here in the Shenandoah Valley, close to Washington, some months later. The Union forces planned to use the valley, which was supposed to have been cleared of rebels, to get behind Lee's lines and threaten Richmond. Instead, they were routed, and Washington itself threatened. Grant's appointment in March 1864 as commander-in-chief of all the Union forces in both East and West was one hopeful sign for the North, and one less so for the South. He was determined to strike against Lee as soon as possible, and chose to do so halfway between Washington and Richmond in the area known as the Wilderness. It was not an auspicious start. Unlike on previous occasions when Union generals had taken a licking from Lee, Grant did not retreat, but moved steadily south and attacked again and again, saying that he would fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. The casualties, though, were frightful. The burial parties had a grim task. Here, after just one battle at Spotsylvania Courthouse, 14,000 bodies had to be disposed of. Another 16,000 had been severely wounded. The North's losses could be replaced, not so those of the South. Some of the most poignant photographs to come out of the Civil War are those of the rebel dead that fourth summer of the struggle. The Confederacy was bleeding to death. Knowing this, Grant kept up the pressure, but Lee met his every ploy. It was a question of whose strength would sap first.
The men were still fighting by old-time tactics, in a sense. Robert E. Lee, Sir Winston Churchill often called, the last of the great old-fashioned generals. But this war also produced a new breed of general, the Grants and Shermans and Thomases of the North, men who believed that war was no longer merely a chess game, but rather war was a conflict that had to be taken to an entire country, its civilian population included. We call that today total war. We accept that today as war. It was a great transition for the people back then, which is simply why Sherman's march through Georgia and to the sea seems so brutal and atrocious.
William Tecumseh Sherman is the Civil War general most associated with the term total war. He had succeeded Grant in the West. Sherman now sought to exert his particular brand of pressure on the Confederates. He began his drive towards Atlanta as Grant was moving against Lee. The terrain was very different, and the tactics too. Sherman preferred to outflank his opponent rather than attack him head-on. The occasion when he did not, here at Kennesaw Mountain in June, he suffered more casualties in a few hours than in the whole of his campaign hitherto. Because his goal, Atlanta, was in sight, Sherman's patience seemed to escape him. The lesson was not lost, and he promptly returned to his previous tactics, which again worked. By early July, Sherman was within 5 miles of Atlanta. As he began his bombardment, panic seized its citizens, and those who could fled, jamming the roads and crowding the trains going south. When the citizens complained, he merely increased the shelling. War, he told them, was hell, and the sooner they surrendered, the better. The fighting was bitter, but the heart had been knocked out of the defenders. Atlanta faced the inevitable. As Sherman's men entered the ravaged city, Lincoln had the victory he needed to ensure his re-election.
Bring the good old bugle, boys, we'll sing another song. Sing it with a spirit that will start the world along. Sing it as we used to sing it, 50,000 strong, while we were marching through Georgia. Hurrah, hurrah, we bring the Jubilee. Hurrah.
Sherman turned Atlanta over to his forces and ordered its citizens to leave. When they protested, he simply replied, "You cannot refine war." To his colleagues, he argued, "We may not change the hearts of these people, but we can make them so sick of war that generations would pass before they would again resort to it." This is as near a definition of total war as one is likely to get.
Sherman's dashing Yankee boys will never reach the coast. So the saucy rebels said, and 'twas a handsome boast. Had they not forgot, alas, to reckon with the host, while we were marching through Georgia.
Sherman now began his wrecking march to the sea. Before leaving Atlanta, he ripped up every railroad track there was. He was cutting himself loose from his supply base and would live off the land, destroying what he did not need, determined, as he put it, to make Georgia howl. Lincoln's Navy gave him that summer a more dramatic success in some ways than Atlanta, when in a daring raid they closed the last of the blockade-running ports on the Gulf Coast, Alabama's Mobile Bay. It was a further tightening of the squeeze on the Confederacy. David Farragut was the hero of the hour. His order to his fleet, when it became stuck in a minefield of "damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead," has become as famous as any that Nelson issued during the Battle of Trafalgar. Farragut negotiated the mines and went on to eliminate the opposing fleet, including their new giant ironclad, the Tennessee, on which the rebels had placed such great hopes. All in all, it had been quite a summer for the North, and Lincoln in particular. Many Southerners now felt they had shot their last bolt.
I think the South had 3 chances to win the war. I think in the very first few months, they could have pulled off a military victory. In the summer of '61, I think they were that strong in comparison to what the North was at that time. I think by the end of '61, that was gone. I think their second hope for success was foreign recognition, if that was at all a reality. And I think Antietam ended that. And their third hope was a political settlement, was Lincoln's defeat. And the fall of Atlanta ended that.
Northerners wondered why Southerners fought on after Atlanta and put it down to a death wish. Certainly the way they kept coming at the Yankee guns suggested that. Many a Union officer commented after a battle on the fearful disregard for life by the rebels opposing him. The Confederacy was losing the flower of its manhood as if it had no tomorrow. The bodies of young Southerners told their own dismal tale that spring of 1865 as they lay amid the fiendish bric-a-brac of trench warfare. The terrible siege of Petersburg and Richmond had taken its toll on rebel lives and rebel supplies. It could not go on. Before quitting their capital, the Confederates had blown up the ammunition dumps, but the fires had got out of hand. By the time the first Federal troops entered Richmond, a large part of the city was destroyed, virtually the whole of its business district. For decades afterwards, this area was known simply as the Burnt District. Embers from some of the fires would still be smoldering 2 months later. For a long time, photographs like these would be shown as examples of total war, of what can happen when civilized behavior between peoples breaks down, until, of course, war became even more horrifying in our own century. Jefferson Davis and many of his cabinet had fled southwestwards, hoping to reach Texas, while Lee had aimed to link up with the rest of the Confederate Army in North Carolina. But the Federals had been hounding him ever since his withdrawal from Petersburg.
On the second day, he stopped to try to get some supplies, which he understood had been left at a depot for him. They weren't there. So he wasted 24 hours scrounging the countryside for food. And in that 24 hours, the Federal Army gained on him. So they were on his flanks for the next few days. They cut off one wing of the army at the little Battle of Sailor's Creek just a few miles before he reached Appomattox. And he rose on the 9th of April to start to fight, to break his way out. He suspected that he was ringed, but he didn't know. So the battle opened early in the morning. And when the people who were going forward in his front ran into overwhelming, impossible opposition, he called it off. He realized he was surrounded, and he didn't want to sacrifice his entire force.
Lee fought the war with dignity and with honor and with as much courage as he could muster. And when the end came, he did something that most people in the world like. They like a good loser. Lee, for example, could have continued fighting, and several of his men begged him to take the war away from its formal aspect and turn it into guerrilla war. Let the Southern soldiers take to the hills and the back alleys and the byways and fight guerrilla war. And this was something natural to do because most civil wars are fought that way. And today in the world, as you doubtless know, there are civil wars raging out of control, and they will continue for generations to come. But Lee said no. He felt that to do that would not achieve the one thing the South wanted, its independence. And so at Appomattox on Palm Sunday, 1865, he and Grant sat down. And as two gentlemen, they said, in essence, in the name of God, this is enough.
Lee said he would rather die 1,000 deaths than submit to Grant. But despite talk of unconditional surrender, the Northerner was anxious to offer terms that would end the 4-year-old war. They met at the home of Wilmer McLean, who, trying to get away from the war, had moved from Manassas following the battle there 4 years before, when his house had been taken over by the Confederate Army. The troops here at Appomattox Courthouse were surprised how easily the war ended. Provided they left their weapons, the rebels were free to go home. A careworn Lincoln, this is his last photograph, decided to celebrate the war's end by taking his wife to the Ford Theater. The play, an English comedy, Our American Cousin, had no particular claim to distinction. But the real drama was not acted out on the stage. During the performance on April 14th, while the Lincolns were sitting in the presidential box, a failed actor, John Wilkes Booth, claiming strong Confederate sympathies, entered and sought, in his own way, to reverse the result of the Civil War by shooting the president in the back of the head. In the ensuing pandemonium, Booth escaped, though he broke his leg while jumping to the stage. Lincoln was carried to a house across the street where he died early the next morning. Both North and South were stunned at the news. After the joy and relief at the war's end, for many, this plunge into early grief was too much. While the crowds wept as they filed past his funeral bier, few could deny the injustice of it all. That having achieved such a remarkable victory, Lincoln was now not to enjoy its fruits. Many realized even then just how much the nation would miss his political skills in the difficult times to come. There were the problems of reconstructing the South and restoring the rebel states to the Union. Few had thought much about it, apart from Lincoln. Certainly not the new president, Andrew Johnson, ironically a Southerner and not of Lincoln's party, who had merely been chosen as a running mate to balance the ticket. When the sadness had been expended, the real world had to be faced. Lincoln's death left millions of Americans apprehensive about the future. The war might be over, but the peace remained to be won. Meanwhile, the long journey of the martyred president back to his final resting place at Springfield, Illinois, drew the country together and began the process of transforming the flesh and blood political leader into the legendary national hero. The manhunt for Booth and his accomplices went on, for most were convinced he could not have plotted the murder alone. Some were speedily caught. It turned out that the original intention had been merely to kidnap Lincoln and hold him hostage to win concessions for the South. Nearly 2 weeks after the event, Booth was cornered in Virginia and shot when refusing to surrender. The executions of some of the conspirators on July 7th attracted world attention, in particular because they included a woman, Mary Surratt, who ran the boarding house where Booth had hatched the original kidnapping plot. Some of the witnesses turned their eyes, unable to watch the hangings. Soldiers were posted by the authorities, fearful that the whole business was part of a wider plot to usurp the Union. By the time justice had run its terrible course, the North had had its victory parades and the troops had gone home. Southerners were picking up life again, but were pondering on what might have been.
Their shivered swords are red with dust, their plumed heads are bowed. Their haughty banner, trailed in dust, is now their martial shroud. And plenteous funeral tears have washed the red stains from each brow, and the proud forms, by battle gashed, are free from anguish now. The muffled drum's sad roll has beat the soldier's last tattoo. No more on life's parade shall meet that brave and fallen few. On fame's eternal camping ground their silent tents are spread, and glory guards with solemn round the bivouac of the dead.
When I was a boy, back in the 1930s, there were old maids who had never married because the men they would have married had been killed in that war. There were still signs of what that war had done.
It created a different physiology, human physiology of the whole South. Most of the survivors of the war were physically maimed. There were a few who came back whole, but I was looking recently at some muster rolls of regiments that had returned from the war. You'll go down a long list of a name and they'll say over to the side, lost an arm, lost an eye, lost a leg. So it changed the whole way manhood looked, and it led to a comment by Mary Chestnut, who wrote this great diary from Dixie, in which she said, women of the South are going to have a new definition of male beauty because the whole man just doesn't exist anymore. Take a small town like Calvert, Texas, near where I live. They sent 71 men to the war out of a male military population of 115, and 20 returned.
In all, 620,000 died. The war was costly in other ways, too. Plantation houses became deserted or were bought up by Northerners. What little industry there had been, such as the great Tredegar Iron Works at Richmond that had supplied half the weapons of the Confederacy, fell into disuse. It would be many decades before the South tried in earnest to become industrialized. The Ku Klux Klan first appeared shortly after the war. Pledged to oppose Negro equality, many of them were Confederate Army veterans bent on overturning at least one of the struggle's tangible results. By the early part of the century, the Klan could parade openly in Washington itself. Associated with intimidating blacks and those whites trying to help them, their weapons were the torch and the noose. Attempts over the years to eradicate them failed. They were too deeply rooted in white Southern society. The Klan reared its head whenever moves were made to allow Negroes to exercise their political rights. At times, they appeared to be the paramilitary arm of local white politicians while masquerading as upholders of the faith. The hoods concealed officers of the law as well as plain thugs. Their ceremonies, like their garb, were designed to terrorize, not reconcile. Blacks could not expect the same justice as whites. Whites taking the law into their own hands by lynching blacks was the most hideous aspect of that inequality. Lynchings in the South increased markedly after the Civil War, whereas before they had been rare. A crowd out for a Saturday evening clam bake, perhaps? Just like any other picnicking group in the States between the world wars? But no, the purpose was hardly social. For blacks, there would always remain the feeling that the eventual road to reunion between North and South was paved with their shattered hopes and disregarded rights. Those who protested were not always just ignored. Often a less certain fate awaited them. Many were not content simply to hand out leaflets. They were determined to convince whites of their entitlement to eat, mix, and talk with them. Segregated restaurants became a particular focus for action by young blacks. Those who tried to breach them had to endure not only angry words, not only being ignored when it came to ordering food, but also indignity and humiliation, and often violence. They were in a minority in the restaurant, and the mood of the majority at times could be ugly. Such scenes are difficult for today's generations of black and white to appreciate. They help to understand why young Negroes were angry and bitter. Such action was invariably considered provocative by the police. tanks outside schools in the United States during the mid-1950s were not the best advertisement around the world for the American way of life. They were trying to uphold a Supreme Court decision that black children should not be prevented from attending white schools, that segregation in public education was unconstitutional. It was nearly 100 years since Lincoln had proclaimed emancipation. Despite protests, the administration of the day meant business. As usual, the threats from the white supremacists were fairly explicit, but the weight of the federal legal system was now on the side of the Negro. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as the black Southern leader. A charismatic preacher, his tactic was simply to march and demonstrate peacefully. Thanks to the media, that was the image the world had of the protesters, whereas the Southern authorities came to be associated with oversized white-faced policemen blocking the path of the demonstrators with their batons. A climax of the 1960s campaign was the march to the Alabama state capitol in Montgomery, where the Confederacy was launched 100 years before. With the song Dixie and the Confederate flag as symbols of resistance to the movement, the Civil Rights campaign seemed almost a replay of the Civil War. The nation's leaders now courted their black brethren. Legislation to meet their demands was in the pipeline.
Today will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
The Washington Mall demonstration of August 1963 was the most emotional moment of the whole civil rights campaign.
50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Many of us thought that true freedom was around the corner when we got, say, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when we got the decision in the school segregation cases in 1954, and when you got the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But as we look at things, and as we see the resistance continuing, we know that those corners have a way of getting longer and longer and farther away. And it simply means that, that what we thought we got in 1865, we didn't get. What we thought we got in 1965, we didn't get. And that one must persist if one is to achieve these things.
The The Civil War may still not be over as regards the aspirations of black Americans. Yet, it was the making of the United States, and it is for that that those who fought and died will be remembered.